We know from our history lessons that the First Fleet arrived in 1788 to stake a claim on New South Wales and establish a British colony in the Pacific. But did we know that they were actually on strict orders to get along with the people already here? In clear acknowledgement that the land was already occupied, the British government's instructions to the first governor, Arthur Phillip, was that he should talk with the natives and to conciliate their affections, enjoining all our subjects to live in amity and kindness with them. But of course, that's not how things went down. Despite the obvious and acknowledged fact that the continent was already occupied, the British declared the land terra nullius, land belonging to no one, a no man's land, creating a legal fiction for the takeover and permanent occupation of Australia. A settler colony had to take the land from those already there, and they had to take it by force. But Aboriginal people fiercely fought back. They resisted the takeover of their land. Remember Pemulwuy? He was a lawman, a keeper of the law, a punisher of those who broke the law. From 1792, Pemulwuy led raids on settlers in Darug country. Sometimes they managed to get him back, but he was a hard man to keep down. In 1795, with a fractured skull and buckshot in his body, he managed to escape from custody, even while wearing leg irons. This added to the belief in his mystique as a clever man. He even squared off against British soldiers in the Battle of Parramatta in 1797. He kept up his guerrilla tactics for 10 years, and according to his descendant Richard Green, with simple spears, rocks, boomerangs, stones, he defeated the British army that they sent there. Every single soldier that they sent in pursuit of Pemulwuy either walked back into the community with their saddle over their shoulders, or they didn't make it back. Governor King posted a reward for bringing Pemulwuy in, dead or alive, and on the 2nd of June 1802, Pemulwuy was finally shot and killed. And so the British takeover of the Aboriginal people's lands continued. This takeover was brutal and indiscriminate, nowhere more so than in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. Although their population had fallen to fewer than 2,000, the Aboriginal people of Tasmania were well organised in their resistance. In 1828, Governor Arthur issued his now famous proclamation implying equality under the law for both black and white citizens in an attempt to calm the escalating situation. This equality was, however, non-existent, with white people seldom properly punished for the same crimes for which Aboriginal people were hanged. Despite this, the fighting continued so that Governor Arthur declared martial law, labelling Aboriginal people as open enemies of the state. In 1830, Arthur formed the Black Line, designed to force the people from their lands. 2,200 settlers, military, police and convicts formed 3 separate lines of men moving slowly across the Tasmanian landscape. Resistance continued for a while and many Aboriginal people were killed. Others surrendered. The small population of about 200 Indigenous people who remained in the settled districts of Tasmania after the Black Line were removed to Flinders Island. Large-scale settler violence wasn't just confined to Tasmania. On the 10th of June 1938, a party of stockmen killed 28 Wirraray people on the banks of Mile Creek in northern New South Wales. This was happening all across the frontier, of course, but this time it was to be different. 11 of the 12 perpetrators were arrested. They were first acquitted, but in December 1838, 7 of the 11 were executed after a second trial. This was the first time white men had been held to account for killing Aboriginal people, but again, this doesn't mean equality under the law. When the British took over the land of Australia, traditional First Nations law was displaced along with their people. British law was established in all the colonies. While Aboriginal people were regarded as British subjects, they were typically not afforded the legal rights enjoyed by others under the Crown. Aboriginal people could not give evidence and could not be witnesses. This was said to be because Aboriginal people could not swear on the Bible as they were not Christians. They were largely outside the law. But for governors, the case of the Myall Creek massacre showed that Aboriginal people needed protection from settler violence. The official government policy in the colonies and states of Australia in the late 19th and early 20th century for Aboriginal people was called protection. The title of protection, however, was a bit of a misnomer because really it was a policy of segregation and control. Aboriginal people, said to be a dying race under the influential and convenient idea of social Darwinism at the time, were rounded up and put on missions and reserves all over Australia. Missions were set up by Christian missionaries to civilise the natives. Here's a picture of the Canibba mission in South Australia. Aboriginal protection boards gradually took over from missions in all states in the late 19th century. These boards took control of where Aboriginal people could live and work, who they could marry, what they could spend their wages on. In short, all aspects of their lives. From the 1880s, missions or reserves were limited to so-called full-bloods who are expected to die out. Those people labelled half-castes, though, were considered to be able to merge with the general population and eventually their aboriginality would disappear. So whole communities, whole families didn't necessarily go to a mission or reserve together. Lighter-skinned people were selected to be trained up so they could assimilate into white society. At the lowest socio-economic level, of course. Aboriginal children of mixed race were removed from their families and placed in training homes. From 1910 to 1940, 6,000 children were removed from their families in New South Wales. Here's a picture of the Cootamundra Girls' Home where some of the girls were taken to. Children were removed and trained to go out and work. Many Aboriginal boys were trained to work as stockmen at much lower wages. Girls were trained to work as domestic servants. The idea of the benefits of assimilation meant that mixed-race children continued to be removed from their families right up until the late 1960s. About 20,000 people in New South Wales now belong to what has become known as the stolen generations. And so we see that the establishment of the nation-state of Australia was contingent upon the dispossession of the Indigenous First Nations who had occupied their lands for thousands of years. Australia was not settled, it was taken by force. It was taken through the legal chicanery of terra nullius. It wasn't land that belonged to no one, it was occupied, used and revered by the First Nations people. No treaty was ever signed, land was never given up, sovereignty was never ceded. They resisted the takeover of their homelands, and so it had to be taken by force. These are the frontier wars that are usually absent from the Australian national narrative. Aboriginal people were killed by violence, by disease, were rounded up and removed to missions and reserves far from their own territory. Their children were stolen. Their culture, beliefs and laws derided and decimated. And yet they didn't die out. They didn't give up. The First Nations of Australia prevailed. I'm Diane Colman. Thank you.